I think the film does a marvelous job of capturing that beauty and the romanticism itself of Oxford. I've never been, but I now feel like I kind of have a slightly better sense of the place. I mean, there's a lot of old places in the world, but what do you think makes Oxford so magical or special?
I really think you'd feel in the stones thousands of years of people who have thought deep thoughts there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people are pursuing learning and thinking and conversation and meeting people where they're at. Um, there is a magic and a beauty to it. I mean, it's just the architecture is just stunning, and the way the light falls and the way that it is like Narnia. You know, you're walking on a basic busy street with bookstores and everything, and then you go through an arch in a college, and all of a sudden it's a whole other world. There's a tremendous beauty to it, and that's conducive to contemplation and thinking and conversation and having a pint.
Are the classes really that small?
Yes, they are. It's called the tutorial system. Mm-hmm.
Was there a point where you did end up staying at the provost's home?
Yes.
Okay.
The figure, and there's sort of a few figures that had to be collapsed just because we couldn't have so many characters in the film. but yes, I absolutely, actually, that's one of the things that really spoke to me about Christians was how they walked their talk. They weren't perfect people by any means, but they were living their lives differently. And one of those things that they did was hospitality, or just meeting people where they're at, asking people questions, seeing somebody's burnt out and offering them a meal or a night away or whatever. And that really was an incredible thing to experience. It's different than friendship, it's fellowship, and it runs deeper.
I'd like to talk about the ingenious casting of Mark Williams in his role. To me, he's such a sublime choice, especially considering his work on G.K. Chesterton's Father Brown, for which he, plays that fantastic role. Whose idea was it to cast him? And do you know the answer to that question? And how did all that come about?
Oh gosh, well, most of the casting, was done by Evolve Studios. Ken Carpenter, Ryan Whitaker. We were big fans. All of us are big fans of so many of the British actors. All of them are fantastic. So I know that they were thrilled to get them on board. But the casting was not in my hands. So I was just thrilled that it worked out like it did. Absolutely delighted. They're all wonderful.
Is his character based on a real life professor in your life?
All the professors are quirky people. I am one. They're quirky people, but you can't make this stuff up. I mean, they are, they love what they do. And I think they were able to convey that my Oxford professors were geniuses and people of great thought, and many of them of great heart as well, open their homes to us, have these small tutorials where you're responsible for your ideas, which is a very unusual in our culture, but also they care for you very deeply because they know that you're one of their students. So often there's quite a close relationship, but they're also very passionate about what they're teaching and what they embody in that way. And many of them are really interesting characters.
I presume the concept of that teaching style is more so instead of just to teach the subject matter, but also to teach people how to think and obviously analyze the subject matter.
Yes, absolutely. Take responsibility for your ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, did you get to talk to any of the cast before filming?
I did. We were brought out to England, my husband and I, for part of the filming, which was a really beautiful experience. And so I had the pleasure of meeting Phyllis Logan and Mark Williams and Michael Culkin, several of them in person. They were just a delight. And I have a small cameo in the film that was filmed in the same room in which I went to a C.S. Lewis Society meeting before I was a believer myself. And I was able to share the same lines that I heard that sat with me and unsettled me so deeply.
Yeah, you got to have the little part there in your own.
That was Ryan's idea. It was a great sort of inside joke and a great circle of.
Well, it's funny because in the movie in the garden, what was it? Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. That was based on a true story as well. And the fellow who plays the judge in that movie was actually one of the lawyers that was involved in the underlying case, who was one of who was involved in the mix too. So it's interesting where you sometimes get the real person in the movie, but in a different role, which is kind of fun and nifty. So were you able to contribute anything with any of the cast that made a difference in how they approached their characters or otherwise, or was it left entirely up to script and direction?
That's a great question. Mainly up to script and direction, but I was really touched. I mean, I did get to meet and get to know Rose Reid, who plays me, which is a really weird sentence to say, but she's a far more glorious doppelganger and better version of myself. and she's a bibliophile and has a lovely faith, and is just a beautiful person inside and out. So I really felt it was lovely to get to know her. And she pulled on some of that friendship a little bit too, but a lot of it she had to develop on her own. So many of them I didn't meet until they were into character, but it was fun to have met them with my husband and to have had that relationship.
Well, that actually brings up a question. I mentioned earlier that while watching the movie, I kind of felt like faith sneaks up on you in the movie and had to win you over despite some resistance. And I guess the same could be said for Kent too. Is that kind of is that really how that unfolded?
Pretty similarly, I beat him up pretty badly.
Geez. So
Yes, he's a brave man.
Does he still have the moniker TDH?
Well, now he's TBH, tall, bald, and handsome.
Oh, gee, well, there you go. I'll adopt that too.
So he was probably mortified by that. He's much more introverted and shy and doesn't really want any of the attention. But he's a TBH now, quite delightfully. So.
That's funny. So there are quite a few voices in the academic space now taking the mantle from people like C.S. Lewis. I guess people like John Lennox, Alistair McGrath. I mean, I was just curious if any of those voices or professors like them were walking the halls of Oxford in your time.
Well, Alistair McGrath very graciously endorsed the book. He was a professor of my husband's. And so a great influence, lovely man. I didn't have him personally as a professor, my husband did, but I just very much appreciated his example and his work. So there is a really rich intellectual history in Christian thought, and that's actually what moved me too. I just assumed that you couldn't be thoughtful and a Christian, that, faith and intellect had to be antithetical, right? And any idiot would know that. And it's incredibly condescending, right? When there's actually this immense rich history, and there's actually things that we live in our society that we don't even ascribe or recognize as being Christian, and they are.
Well, and I was going to actually ask you a question about that later on, which is, you have all these Sheldon Cooper types, you know what I mean? And, where you have these highly intellectualized people, and sometimes that doesn't necessarily jive with the concept of faith. Did you find that some of these highly intellectualized professors were people of faith? And when you did find that to be the case, because the movie indicates it, but again, you said there may have been some liberties. Did you find that some of the professors were people of faith? And if so, did that catch you by surprise, based on how intellectual they were and how intellectual you were at the time?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think the film took liberties with that aspect at all. Actually, it very much conveyed it, that I was gobsmacked to meet people who were Christians who were so intelligent. I mean, it just rattled my stereotypes. And that had a thoughtful faith, and we're pursuing different things, science or literature or history or whatever, and all different stripes, especially at graduate work. People are from all over the world. So to meet people from Germany, Africa, whatever, I was on a Commonwealth scholarship. So I met people who were wealthy, poor, whatever, different Commonwealth countries, who believed in the same Christ. And it was incredible. I hadn't really thought of that mere Christianity. And they were all pursuing different things with intelligence and passion. So that rattled my cage. And I experienced people up close who lived this faith out in forms of their care for people too, David. I think that's what was so striking. I had provosts who were incredibly powerful, eminent men, for instance, who opened their homes or threw an engagement party, or, spoke to homeless people. They lived out their faith very, without attracting any attention to it in that sense. And that really spoke to me.
Did the Eagle and Child play a role in your journey other than as a spot for a pint and a good book? And I mean, were you aware, or did you care about the significance it carries for so many people?
Well, never underestimate the power of a pint and a good book.
Yeah, right.
And some delightful company to discuss it with, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Eagle and Child, I think where the Inklings gathered, that kind of we work so hard as undergraduates, as students in North American culture. We really do. And of course they do at Oxford as well and Cambridge and that. But what was really amazing in the British culture was that they had this crazy notion, the British Academy, that you shouldn't have a job while you're a student, at least to start. You should be focusing on your studies. And so you have time, as much as you're working hard, but you have time. There's this culture of talking and walking and going out to a pub and everything. And I think that ability to digest and, as I said, have responsibility for your ideas and have conversation, that disagreement is not equated with hate. And like the Aristotelian notion that you can entertain many ideas at once without necessarily accepting any of them. There is a civility there, and that at least opens the door to talking about the things that really matter.
It'll be obvious to anyone who sees the film or reads your book the importance of C.S. Lewis to your journey. And Lewis not only wrote the book that inspired your journey, but he himself was an Oxford professor, right? And as was his friend J.R.R. Tolkien. Did that strike you then as especially special?
Well, it was very inconvenient because I didn't expect a professor to be a Christian.
Yeah.
Right. And the irony is I had known many Christians in Canada. I just didn't really realize I knew them. They had spoken to me in ways that played out in my life later. So sometimes the gospel is overt and sometimes it's embodied, right? There's different ways to plant seeds, but I, as I grew to read more of his work, I admired his stance and his authenticity and the range of topics that, he could write on grief and he could write on prayer and he could write on science fiction or whatever else. And the same thing with Tolkien. I mean, what's so interesting with Tolkien, right, is he's doing all of this through fantasy, but it's still pointing to the real. And so I did them really moving that way.
Selfish question. Did you ever try to find his old office at Oxford while you were there in school or stroll by his family house in the Kilns?
Yes, I did. I fangirled.
That's why I asked, because I would.
Yeah.
Once you were introduced to his work and his associations, did any of the other inklings jump out at you?
Yes, absolutely. And they are just this wonderful group of writers, such a wealth of ideas that sometimes go unnoticed, I think, in the larger culture. But I ended up really becoming a big fan of the Wade Center, for instance, at Wheaton, which is one of the largest collections of the Inklings, and realizing by proxy, Charles Williams and so how many other excellent writers there were. Really, I had touched a little bit on George MacDonald, but hadn't read him so much more overtly. His influence on Lewis, and then also by proxy writers like Dorothy Sayers, who maybe dropped in here and there with the Inklings, but sort of were part of that circle. Really interesting writers who wrote in many genres. Sayers writes detective novels as well as theology. So all stripes of thinkers. And what's so fun is their conversation they had among each other. As well as the different stripes and different ways that they approached imaginative representations of the gospel in their works, as well as academic.